In this final session, we're going to be talking about the idea of how good work can encourage positive impacts in social causes, and what basically makes that possible. Our last speaker brings over 10 years of experience as a chief executive at the Royal Society of Arts. He is also the author of the Taylor Report, which is a monumental work in the sharing economy. Please give a warm welcome to Mathew Taylor.
Thank you, Mix. I was just explaining to Mix that last night I walked into a wall. I was at home and I was sober, but I walked into a wall. It's probably just my age. So I didn't sleep, and I've taken a lot of ibuprofen and a lot of paracetamol. So there may be moments when my presentation becomes slightly surreal, or I just drift off to sleep. So that's fine. We're all kind of friends together. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I don't know how many English people there are in the audience, but like most English people, I shamefully can only speak a few words of any other language, so I'm always rather embarrassed when I go abroad, and it's just assumed that people from all over Europe will be able to understand English. I was slightly worried that there might be interpreters here, but obviously you don't need interpreters. I have a slight horror of interpreters that goes back to an experience my father had. Many, many years ago, he did a speech. He's an academic. He did a speech in Europe. And my father, being of a kind of certain age, he likes to tell corny jokes in his speeches. So he gathered the interpreters around before he spoke, and he said, I might tell a couple of jokes. Is that going to be okay? And they said, no, we'll try. So he started doing his speech, and to, I think, illustrate a point about social identity, he said it's like the person who goes to the doctor and says, doctor, I think I'm a moth. And the doctor says, well, you don't need to speak to me, you should speak to a psychiatrist. Why did you come here? And he says, well, your light was on. And just like you, actually, the response was exactly like that, really. About 5 people laughed. And so he thought he would plunge on, and so later on in his speech, I think making a point about crime and deviance, he had the throwaway comment. He said, I'm very worried about theft in multi-storey car parks. It seems to me it's wrong on so many levels. And just like you, the laughter started to increase. He felt growing confidence, really, about this. And then at the end, the interpreters gathered round, and he thanked them. And he said, how was it with the jokes? He said, how did you translate the joke about the giraffe who walks into the cocktail bar and says, the highballs are on me? And it was at that point that they said, no, Professor, we didn't try to translate any of your jokes. It's just every time you told a joke, we simply said, and now Professor Taylor is telling a joke. So I have a kind of horror of interpretation ever since then, and also I've realized that I won't be telling any jokes for the rest of my talk. So when you talk about a subject, as I'm going to talk about the platform economy and good work today, it's customary to try to make some kind of references to concrete experience that you've had. But of course, if you're talking about the platform economy, we're kind of overwhelmed with experiences of it. It's part of everybody's everyday life. I'm staying at an Airbnb flat just down the road. Well, of course, it's not an Airbnb flat, it's someone's flat. And I'm an Airbnb host myself, a little chalet in the south of England. And you go to the flat, and it doesn't feel transactional, it feels almost relational. There's a nice note, and the woman who owns the flat has recommended a bar and a restaurant to go to and give us some little tips and said, please enjoy my house. And it feels cozy. I've got a daughter. She loves the fact that it's a house rather than the kind of anonymity of a hotel room. A couple of weeks ago, I went to see my son, who plays semi-professional football in Pittsburgh. I was at the airport. He arrived to pick me up. I only realized when he arrived that he's a Lyft driver. And so I talked to him about that. He said, I don't really earn enough money from being a soccer player, so I drive for Lyft, and it's great. I can just top up my earnings. It's been fantastic, so I'm only going to be in Pittsburgh for a year. I've got to know a bit about the place through driving and talking to people, and I'm saving up to do my MA and to do my master's in economics. And the great thing is I love podcasts. I can listen to podcasts all day long. The only thing is that I'm very left-wing, so I have to make sure I don't put left-wing podcasts on if I've got a Trump supporter in the car, because it can... You have to remember there are 2 guns for every human being in America, so you just need to be very careful about the podcasts you listen to in the car. But, I mean, those fragments tell us something that I'm sure you've been talking about all day, which is that when we talk about the platform economy, that it's incredibly diverse, that it's very kind of personal, people's experience of it is very personal, that people's experience of it is very subjective. It depends where they are in their lives, what they're trying to do in their lives, what else is going on. And because of that, I think it's quite hard to develop a narrative, to develop an account, a way of thinking about the platform economy. And so what I'll try and do is to suggest some kind of path through this, the things that we might want to talk about if we were to try to have an overall account of the platform economy and how it is we should be thinking about it. And so what I'm going to talk about is regulation and innovation and values. So let me start with regulation. So regulation is something I've been thinking about a lot because the Prime Minister of the UK, Theresa May, well actually I haven't checked a news feed for the last few hours, so I'm assuming she's still Prime Minister. You can never be absolutely sure. But she asked me to undertake a review, and I made a number of recommendations in that review about what needed to happen in relation to the regulation of the gig economy. And when we talk about regulation, generally speaking, what we're talking about is how is it we can ensure that the platform economy, I'm going to use the words platform economy and gig economy interchangeably. I know they're not exactly the same concepts, but how can we ensure that the gig economy is working in a way which aligns, broadly speaking, with the kind of framework of rules and norms which we apply to the economy as a whole and to the rest of employment as a whole. And the issues that are generated by this, generated by how it is we get the gig economy to align with the norms and rules and regulations that we have, varies from country to country, but as you know, there are common features of those kinds of debates. And so one of those common features in many, many countries, most countries I think, is the kind of fuzzy borderline between somebody being self-employed, being a freelancer, and being a worker. And of course this is doubly important because if you are a worker, you'll get employment rights of some kind or another. In Britain, we have kind of 3 levels, and so you get some worker rights. If you're a casual worker, not the full rights, but some rights. But if you're self-employed, you get very few rights, virtually no employment rights. But it's also important for tax purposes, because if you hire someone who's self-employed, you pay less tax on their labour, and they pay slightly less tax themselves. So the goal of regulation in my report was really around fairness. How do we try to ensure that the system was as fair as possible? So I talked about the need for not just one-way flexibility, the flexibility of the organisation towards the individual, but genuine two-way flexibility of the individual towards the organisation. Clarity, how could we have a set of rules that people understood and that were clear, because that certainly isn't the case in the UK system and I think in other systems. And most particularly, how could you avoid a system that created incentives, perverse incentives for people to try to disguise employment as something else, which is a big issue in the UK, what is sometimes called bogus self-employment. So the attempt of organisations to portray people who really look quite like employees as people who are actually self-employed. And so I had a whole number of recommendations in that area, and the government will be responding in the next 2 or 3 weeks. It's taken a long time, but they will be responding. But I want to suggest in relation to regulation that we need to think about this as having two stages to reform. So the first stage is the stage that I've talked about, which is the stage of how it is you try as best you can to get the gig economy to fit in with the existing set of rules, regulations and norms which govern employment and tax policy. But I think the second step, which I also talked about in my report, is actually to say, given the way in which work is changing, and given the fact that the gig economy, platform economy is with us, and there are other changes in work as well, actually what we need to do is to reconsider some of the characteristics of our system as a whole. So not just minor adjustments, but actually think more deeply about the ways in which you would change the system. And in particular, I think what we have to do over time is to bring together both the employment regulation and entitlement system on the one hand and the tax system on the other, and have a more level playing field. So at the moment there are major differences between your entitlements as a self-employed person, the degree to which self-employed people provide for themselves, for sickness, for retirement, for training, and major differences in the way the tax system works. I think in the long run we should tax labour the same regardless of how that labour is provided. So whether or not you're an employee or a worker or self-employed, if you hire labour, you should pay the same broad tax level on that labour. If you did that, you would remove the incentives which exist for bogus self-employment. And similarly, I think through such a system of a more uniform form of taxation, both for those who hire labour and those who provide labour, we can start to build the entitlements of self-employed people, of freelancers. So we can start to think about the ways in which freelancers can contribute to incentivise schemes to provide for sickness insurance, to provide for potentially training, and most of all, to provide, to start to save for retirement, which, as you know, the vast majority of freelancers, particularly lower paid freelancers, are doing absolutely nothing to prepare themselves for retirement, for their pension needs. So I think in terms of regulation, the story is, first of all, let's try to adjust the systems so that they work and we can take out perverse incentives and unfairness. But then let's secondly think about how actually in the medium term we want to reform the system as a whole, so that in a sense we're more neutral about the way in which labour is provided. Certainly in the UK, the Treasury looks at this issue not through the question of employee fairness. It looks at the issue because the growth of self-employment and freelance work is creating a big fiscal hole, because people who are freelance workers, and particularly people who set up their own companies, sole trader companies, just pay a lot less tax, and that's creating quite a big problem for the Exchequer. So that's a set of issues around regulation. The second set of issues are around innovation. Now, often when people talk about innovation, they'll cite the gig economy as an example of innovation, an example of change driven by technological possibility. And that's true. And there is, I don't need to tell you, there is a huge amount of innovation that is taking place in this space. When I started doing my review for the government, I spent a couple of hours trying to remember the names of the main kind of platforms, but if we went back to that list, I'd find that some of them had grown 5 times as big, some of them had ceased to exist or changed their name, and there's a whole new set that have come along. And that's great. It's great that there are people coming up with new models to meet people's needs, both as consumers of labour and as providers of labour. But I think we need to think about innovation on other levels as well. So one of the things that I find heartening, and maybe it's because I run a kind of progressive organisation and the kind of stance that I've taken on these issues, but a lot of people come to talk to me about the new platforms they're trying to create. And a consistent theme of the conversations I have with those entrepreneurs, who I think would see themselves really as social entrepreneurs, is that they're trying to create work platforms which address some of the systematic problems of the platform economy from the worker perspective. So this is people coming along and saying, well, what can we do to encourage and support people to provide, for example, for sickness insurance? What is it we can do to enable people working through platforms to socialise and come together because of the isolation that people can feel? How is it we can enable collective voice for people working through platforms? How can we have a more equal power relationship between the platform and the individual? How is it we can enable people to progress as platform workers so that they're not stuck doing the same job for the rest of their lives, but there are ways in which that work can build up accreditation, maybe even qualifications that enable them to move on and have choices in their career. So I think we need to be encouraging all of that, and it's quite interesting if you look at the trade union movement, for example. that there are kind of two broad trade union responses to the gig economy. One is sheer hostility, because it is seen as being exploitative and individualistic, and certain companies in that sector appear to be quite hostile to trade unions, and I can understand that. But there's another trade union response, which is to say, well, actually, we need new forms of organisation, often using technology, the so-called worker tech innovations, which are around saying, well, what can we do to organise and support freelance workers? So, for example, there's a union in the UK, Community, who have started setting up small spaces, shared spaces for freelancers to use. They get a very cheap desk and cheap access to broadband, but also a space where people can come in, lawyers can come in, accountants can come in and give them advice and support. So the second level of it, as well as kind of technological innovation and commercial innovation, we need social innovation to think about how it is we can design platforms that address some of the dangers of platform working and exploit some of the opportunities. I also think we need organisational innovation. So at the same time as we're talking about what's going on in the gig economy, there's also lots of conversations going on within organisational settings about the fact that in many ways hierarchies are very kind of problematic. The traditional way of organising firms and workplaces is very problematic. And I hope that what we'll start to see really is that work feels like much more of a continuum. And that in organisations there are much more devolved forms of working, team-based ways of working, ways of enabling individuals to have more autonomy at work, more control over their budgets and over their work process, much more flexibility at work. And that starts to merge with platform working, where people are unable to get together and to organise together and to socialise together. So that actually the big gulf that at the moment in the minds of the public seems to separate the idea of gig work from the idea of a traditional job, that starts to break down, and that we get a continuum of work, and that people are able to choose the form of work which best suits where it is they are in their lives. And then finally, we need policy innovation. So I've talked a bit about this already when I talked about regulation. We need to think about the policy framework that is going to be most powerful to ensure that gig work ends up as being a benign force in society. And I think when we think about policies, it's important to recognise that whether or not the gig economy is good for people depends a lot on things that aren't actually part of the gig economy. So at the moment, I would say the gig economy is largely benign in the UK because we have a very tight labour market. And there's very low unemployment. And so if you're a gig worker, you have a lot of choice, there's a lot of demand for your time. If we had large-scale unemployment, things would feel very differently, and the issues would feel very different, and the sense of exploitation, I think, would be much greater, and the scope for exploitation would be much greater. So the economic environment matters a great deal, but also the kind of welfare framework. The RSA, the organisation I run, is a big advocate of universal basic income. You know, if you had a universal basic income, then many of one's deepest concerns about the gig economy and the possibility of exploitation and insecurity would be addressed if we knew that everybody had a basic subsistence income to fall back on. So this conversation about innovation, we connect innovation to the gig economy. Let's not just talk about technological and commercial innovations. Let's talk about social innovation. Let's talk about organisational innovation. And let's talk about policy innovation. So then finally, which is always the most popular word in my speeches, I find. Finally, I want to talk about values. And I'll just take a little detour, if I might, in talking about values. Because I haven't yet really addressed what's going on in the world. And what's going on in the world is a set of quite worrying things. Political polarisation, the rise of populism, a kind of profound social pessimism, actually. You know, I remember, this will tell you something about my age, but I remember my grandfather, who was an engineer, in the 1960s, and his incredible excitement at technological changes which seem incredibly modest to us. So colour television just blew his mind. He thought it was incredible. He was so excited by it. He said, this is it. You know, colour television today, space travel tomorrow. That was his view. And so not much was going on then, but it felt so exciting. Now, science and technology accelerating at an amazing pace, but yet how do ordinary people feel about it? Pessimistic, they feel worried. And there's a danger here. Because if you think of what's going on, you think about polarization, you think about populism, you think about that pessimism. If we were standing here not talking about technology, but we were talking about globalization, if we'd been standing here 15 years ago, what people might have said about globalization, financial globalization in particular, was this. They might have said, look, the thing about globalization is it's an unstoppable force, so just get out of the way. Nothing you can do to stop it. Can't be stopped. It'll have winners and losers, but there'll be more winners and losers, and the losers just need to suck it up and keep quiet. Globalization will mean that some things you care about, you won't be able to have control over anymore. It's going to reduce your national sovereignty. It's probably going to mean that your population changes quite a lot, but just get over it. And finally, this globalization stuff, you might not understand it, but don't worry, because there's these people in banks, and they're really clever, and they really do understand it, and it's all going to be fine. Okay? Now, as we know, that didn't end well. It didn't end well because of what happened in 2007-8, but it didn't end well because what we are suffering now is a direct consequence of that. But what worries me is that if you think about that narrative, we hear the same narrative about technology. Exactly the same tune. Technology is an unstoppable force. Technology will create winners and losers. There'll be more winners, but the losers just need to suck it up. It'll mean things you care about, children's safety, privacy, the integrity of tax systems. Well, just forget that. That's all old stuff. And even if you don't really understand this, don't worry, because there's these guys in California, and they wear jeans, and they give money to charity, and they're nice to their kids, and what could go wrong? Now, that story is broken down already, it seems to me. So it's really important that when we talk about technological change, as we're doing here, when we talk about the idea that technology is going to make things different for human beings, we have to start from the assertion that this change must be justified in terms of making people's lives better. That has to be our starting point, or else we'll see the pessimism that surrounds us continue to grow, the reaction continue to grow. So in the report that I wrote for the Prime Minister, I was expected to make lots of recommendations, and I did make 53 recommendations, but what I wasn't really expected to do was what I put at the heart of my report. So I called my report Good Work. And the biggest idea in my report was that we should start to care as much about the quality of people's working lives as we do about the quantity of jobs which exist in the economy. And I made a number of arguments for why good work mattered. I said good work matters because the social contract which existed when I started growing up, which was if you have a job, and it was mainly with men, but nevertheless, the social contract which is if you have a job, you'll probably be better off every year and you'll be economically secure. That contract is bust. And for lots of people, it isn't going to come back. So the very minimum we ought to offer in the social contract is that if you have a job, you'll be treated with decency and you'll have the chance to progress. Secondly, I said good work matters because bad work screws you up. Because bad work leads to ill health, it leads to people dropping out of work, it has externalities beyond the individual worker. I said good work matters because in the UK we have a terrible productivity problem, and part of the reason for that productivity problem is bad work, bad management, the continuation of a kind of master and servant view of what goes on at work. I said that good work matters because actually there's a kind of dislocation when politicians in Britain talk about citizens. They say citizens should be active and they should get involved and they should volunteer and they should vote, and the Brexit campaign slogan was take back control. But we still have this idea at work that the deal at work is I pay you, you keep your mouth shut and you do what you're told. And actually, if we want people to be citizens in society, we should want people to be citizens at work as well. Now, in Europe, generally speaking, there's a much more progressive idea about partnership at work. But in the UK, that master and servant view still exists. And then finally, I said good work matters for the reason I'm just explaining to you, which is because of technology. Because we have to implement technology in a way that improves people's working lives. So I think when we start from the idea of the scope that it has to improve people's working lives, and we have to finally abandon an idea, and maybe I'm talking too much from the UK perspective when I say this, but we have to abandon the kind of instrumental view of work, a purely instrumental view of work, that the individual thinks, well, work is a bit shit, but I get paid. And employers do work because they want to make profits, and work is a means to an end. And the state sees work as something which generates revenue. And instead we have to move from an entirely instrumental view of work to a much more intrinsic view of work. Work which says that work, the value of work is not just because it generates wages and profits and goods, but the value of work is the intrinsic satisfaction and fulfillment and opportunities that people get from work. And indeed, to end, what I think that's linked to is if we are going to rediscover optimism, so if we're going to rediscover that sense that it's possible for society to improve and for lives to get better and for the future to be better than the past, and poll after poll shows that fewer and fewer people believe their children's lives or their grandchildren's lives will be better than their own lives. So if we're going to rekindle that sense of optimism, we need to rekindle it around some ideas. And I think one of those ideas should be the idea that work is all work can be and should be intrinsically good. And related to that, maybe what we're also thinking about, can start to think about, is the reinvention of the core ideas of our economy. That the economy that we had for the decades after the Second World War, an economy which in many ways is kind of problematic, was a kind of welfare economy. The idea was that the economy existed over here, that it generated value, and that some of that value was taken by the state, and that money was spent on the welfare state, on public services and on benefits. And that was our kind of welfare economy model. I think we need to move from that welfare economy model to a well-being economy model, where what we instead emphasize is not the idea that there's an economy over here and you suffer that because it generates money which enables you to have good things, but actually that economic activity itself, and principally work, is something which makes you happier and healthier and fulfills you and enables you to grow in your lives. Now, isn't that the kind of idea that might help people break out of the kind of pessimism they feel and start to understand technology's amazing possibilities rather than feel that the robots are coming to take over their lives? Thank you.